What I want to talk about tonight is world peace. And I know we all share the same vision of a world where we don't use war as a means of resolving conflict, and where we live, and as Bob shared in his mission statement, where we find nonviolent ways to resolve conflict. And I want to just focus a little bit on how we think we're doing. And I'd like to start by sharing a conversation I had when I went to the World Beyond War conference in Ireland in 2019. And I had one of the conference attendees, actually, he was a speaker, he was a keynote speaker with an expertise in the weaponization of space. And he came over to thank me for a little presentation I had given the morning of day one about our chapter in Ontario, Canada. And I had been very excited to give that presentation because we just put on an event for International Peace Day. And I had told everybody that we had got 110 people who were not involved in the peace movement to come to our International Peace Day event. And I was very excited about that. And so he thanked me for the presentation. And then he said, "You're new to the peace movement, aren't you?" And I thought about that for a moment, and I thought, well, I've been around the peace movement for years, but activism like this, yes, I am. And I said, "Why are you asking me that? What makes you ask me that?" And he said, "Way too much enthusiasm." And that really struck me, and I've never forgotten it. And I know that some of you, I mean, we were just talking before we started the presentation, some of you have been involved in the peace movement for years and years and years. And what he was basically saying to me, I think, was, "Helen, after you've been involved for a few more years, some of that sense of possibility and hope might get knocked out of you." And I want to just ask you, just go back for a moment and imagine what it must have been like to be at the United Nations on October 24th, 1945, when all the people of the world came together. And their goal, of course, was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Imagine the optimism and the hope and the possibility that was in the room that day. And you may not be aware, but the first resolution that they passed, resolution number 1, called for the elimination of nuclear weapons. There must never, ever, ever again be a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki. And at the same time, the UNESCO organization was founded, and it was going to work for peace and promote peace and security through education and the arts and the sciences and the culture, not through the barrel of a gun, but through arts and culture and education. And there was this very profound statement on a sort of a stone in front of the UNESCO building that said, "Since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defense of peace must be constructed." And so they knew then wars don't begin because of a dispute over a boundary between two countries or because of a need for oil. Wars begin in the minds of men and women. And I just find that very profound. So let's fast forward 75 years later and ask the question, how are we doing? Why do the minds of men and women still allow war? Why do the minds of men and women still allow nuclear weapons? And what does consciousness have to do with it? And I have another question, just a parable really. Why don't these fleas jump out of the open jar? But before we get into talking about these questions, I want to share a story I heard from Kathy Kelly. And Kathy is on the board of World Beyond War, and she's a wonderful American peace activist. Some of you may have already heard of her. And I'm going to let her tell you the story so you hear it exactly the way I did.
Telling a story that troubles me deeply. I learned of it through Jeffrey Stern, writing for the New York Times Magazine. And it's about a very remote district in Yemen called Arhab. And the people in Arhab were facing a really alarming situation. They were running out of water, like, thirsty animals that would starve and plants that can't be irrigated and families that need water. So they took a gamble. They pooled money together and they bought a rig. And they were really hoping this rig would work and it could dig deeper and deeper for water. No water. the rig broke twice. They had it mired in mud. It looked as though all of the money they borrowed and pooled was not going to work. They were doomed. And then one night they struck water. Well, you can imagine, Eureka. There was celebration, there was dancing, there was singing until the wee hours of the morning. And then people that were part of the celebration, men, I suppose all men, were staggering back to their homes in the dark. And what they didn't know is that overhead was a huge missile that had been made in the United States by Raytheon, sold to the Saudis, and the Saudis had targeted their celebration. And so when this missile, a Paveway missile, exploded, these shards of steel went flying through the air 8 times faster than the speed of sound. People were disemboweled, they were beheaded, they were maimed, and many were killed. And the people in Arhab were doing a good thing. They pooled their resources to try to find water. And so I see this as a story of peace literacy that's so needed all across the United States, all across the world. We have to become literate in the stories of those who bear the brunt of our wars.
We have to become literate in the stories of those who bear the brunt of our wars. And there's more to this story, and we'll come back to this later. And we have become literate, haven't we, in what has happened in Afghanistan with the withdrawal of the troops in Afghanistan and the sort of incredible, desperate need for safety and security for some of the people in Afghanistan, and the stories of people who clung to the bottom of airplanes and then fell to their death, and the sort of hand-wringing and teeth gnashing. How could this have happened? How could we have allowed this to happen? How could this have happened? And I don't think we're looking at this with the big picture. We need to be looking at it from the big picture. And so I say to you, since World War II, the United States has killed or helped to kill 20 million people, has overthrown at least 36 governments, has interfered in at least 84 foreign elections, has attempted to assassinate 50 foreign leaders, and has dropped bombs on people in over 30 countries. Now, I first heard that in one sentence from David Swanson, and I was horrified. I was like, I knew, but I didn't know. And I was sort of out of my chair and determined to find out whether this could really be true. And of course it is. We know it is. And it's not just the United States, because we're all students of World Beyond War. And we know that there have been 250 major wars since World War II. And the impact that these wars have been having. We know that war is the #1 contributor to the climate crisis. The nuclear arms race is heating up. And we know about the $2 trillion of taxpayer dollars a year going into this. And so I ask you again, why do the minds of men allow this, still allow war, still allow there to be nuclear weapons on our planet? And what does consciousness have to do with it? And I'd like to start by looking at the third question first. Now, Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And consciousness is not a word that we use a lot in Western culture. And so for the sake of understanding it for tonight's conversation, I'm just going to describe it very simply as an expanded awareness of our inner experience and our outer reality. It's not just awareness, it's not just knowledge, it's sort of an expanded sense of who we are. And I'll just use myself as an example of how consciousness can shift for us as individuals. And here I am launching into the sort of road of life, and I'm getting my undergraduate degree in mathematics and physics. And I have the opportunity to do my second year at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. And this is incredible. There's 4 white students on the campus, and I can honestly say I date my life from before Kenya and after Kenya. And when I came back, I wasn't the same person. I was now a citizen of the world in a way that I couldn't really explain to my friends who hadn't had that experience. I had changed. And the women's movement in the 70s was huge for me. I was part of a consciousness raising group. We met once a week and it was absolutely exhilarating. And again, we had the experience of seeing ourselves for who we really were, rather than kind of seeing ourselves through the eyes of the patriarchy or of men. And that was phenomenal. And I could no more not be a feminist then it would not be possible. I had changed. And here was this big discovery. This came later in life, that we actually create our own experience. The outside world doesn't do things to us. Peter doesn't make me mad, and Jim doesn't make me happy, and the kids don't drive me crazy. I decide how I'm going to react to the events in the outside world. And that's why we can have two people go to an experience and report the same experience and report it completely differently. They've processed it differently in their minds. We create our own experience with our minds. And when we understand that, it becomes extremely important to achieve some sense of inner peace, to have a quiet mind, to be peaceful. And I'm now launched on this path of personal and spiritual growth in search of sort of this sense of inner peace and quiet mind. And definitely have tasted it on many occasions. And that brings me to what I'm going to call peace consciousness, which is what we want, isn't it? It's what we want to see on our planet. And again, for tonight's presentation, I'm going to talk about it in terms of the overview effect that some of you might be aware of. This is a shift in consciousness that many astronauts report experiencing when they're returning to Earth from space. And it includes this sort of profound sense of universal connectedness, and all boundaries dissolve, and sort of international politics just seem so petty and irrelevant. And all that they have is this overwhelming desire to protect the fragile, pale blue dot. This is what they're looking at. So Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And we know, because we're students of World Beyond War, that the consciousness today that is allowing all these wars to happen is based on myths and fears and old beliefs from World War II. And I don't need to go through these with you because I know you're familiar with them. With a different audience, I would. But we know that these myths can all be debunked. And we know that, in fact, the only reason, the one and only reason why wars still continue is that wars are made by cultures that celebrate or tolerate war. I'm Canadian. I live in one of the 10 most peaceful countries in the world, according to the Institute of Economics and Peace. And I live in a culture that tolerates war. And you can tolerate something while telling a pollster you oppose it. Real opposition takes work. Real opposition means you have to show up. So we can think of it like this. The 250 wars since World War II are the tip of the iceberg. And the culture of war that's behind it is so much deeper and so much broader, and it exists continually. And it's in our heads and in our books and in our movies and in our education systems and our monuments and our advertisings. It's everywhere. And we can't possibly be aware of all the ways in which we are influenced by this in our culture. And I just have a little example. I had the experience of Memorial Day in Palm Springs in 2021. And I know some of you live right near Palm Springs. And I'm looking at this through my Canadian eyes, and I'm kind of blown away. There's such a sense of celebration, and all the families are out and partying, and the kids are there, and the music's playing, and World War I jets are dive bombing us, and the kids are screaming with delight. And there's a tank going down the road as part of the procession. And there's school bands playing from junior school to high school. And there's Gold Star families who are part of the procession. And there's even a float for a Human Rights Commission. And I found myself asking myself, should we really be celebrating the death of a loved one? I mean, these families lost a son or a father or a brother. I mean, what is this? And what does the Human Rights Commission have to do with this? And what is this teaching our children? So, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And Eckhart Tolle and many, many others say that we human beings, all of us, We will behave according to the level of consciousness we have in the moment. So, how do we shift ourselves and our culture toward peace consciousness? And Einstein had another question. He said, if I go to the ocean and I say to the fish, tell me about water, the fish is going to say, sorry, I can't tell you anything. Sorry, I can't tell you anything about water. Because it's those of us on shore who have a clearer perspective in water. That's all the fish knows. That's all the fish knows. And so there's a question of perspective. And if we look at this gnashing of teeth about how this could have happened in Afghanistan, we know, you and I know, that those of us who are outside the industrial, military, political, media complex, we're the ones that have the clear perspective. And we know that as long as we believe war is a way to resolve conflict, peace is not possible. And if we look at the situation today with nuclear weapons and recognize that we could reduce the arsenal by 90% and still blow the earth up 10 times over, we can look at that and think this is nuts. It is those of us outside the industrial, military, political complex who have the clear perspective. We know that as long as there is the threat of nuclear weapons, peace is not possible. Peace does not come on the barrel of a gun. We know that. So how can culture shift? And I know some of you have heard me tell this story before, so bear with me. This is the true story of an experiment done by a group of scientists on a small island off the coast of Japan. And they were observing the Japanese monkey over a number of years. And at one point, they started dropping sweet potatoes on the beach. And the monkeys loved the sweet potatoes, but they did not like the grit from the sand. And then one day, one 18-month-old female monkey took her sweet potato to a nearby stream, rinsed it off, ate it, and she loved it. And she showed her mother what she had done, and her mother loved it. And a couple of her friends picked up the habit and they showed it to their mothers. And gradually, over a period of time, a small group of monkeys in the tribe adopted the habit of washing their sweet potatoes in the stream. And then one day, one more monkey who had never done this before took his sweet potato to the stream, washed it, ate it, and he loved it. And to the amazement of the scientists, virtually overnight, almost everyone in the tribe adopted the habit of washing their sweet potatoes in the stream. I think as if the added energy of the 100th monkey was a tipping point for the entire tribe. I'm just gonna. And so we have come to understand that there is a point at which if only one more person tunes in to a new awareness, consciousness will shift so that awareness is picked up by almost everyone. And we kind of know intuitively that's true if we think about it. For example, the Berlin Wall was up for years. It came down on a weekend. Why? Consciousness shifted. Or the women's movement that was so important to me in the 70s. We all know that the world today in the Western world is completely different for our daughters than it was for our mothers. Why? Consciousness shifted. But if we don't want to sort of recognize what we know intuitively, let's go to the research. And Dr. Erica Chenoweth, a professor at Harvard University, asked the question, what percentage of a population must change its thinking to shift the entire population? She did all kinds of research on this, and the answer is going to blow you away. I just find it absolutely amazing. The answer is only 3.5%. 3.5%. That's what it's going to take for consciousness to shift. So, how do we get to the 3.5%? Well, Kathy Kelly said we have to become literate in the stories of those who bear the brunt of our wars. And Kazu Akibayashi said, we have to look at our own thinking as well. It's not just about demilitarizing from a security point of view. We also have to look at our own thinking. And if I could come back to the example of the story of that Kathy shared with us of what happened in Yemen. Jeffrey Stern is a reporter for New York Times Magazine, and he researched this. He went to Yemen, he went to Ahab, he found where the site of the bombing had happened, and he found a remnant of the bomb. And on that remnant, you see it here on the picture, on that remnant, he found a serial number, and he traced it back. He traced it back to a factory in Tucson, Arizona, where the bomb itself had been made. And he interviewed 2 workers from the factory. And to his surprise, he found that morale was really high on the factory floor. Why? Because they believed that they were keeping American servicemen and women safe, because the bombs that they were creating could be dropped from a very, very high place. And hence the risk of enemy return fire was virtually nil. And because the bombs could be dropped with pinpoint accuracy, and hence the risk for civilian casualties was greatly minimized. And it wasn't just that. Raytheon was very clever. Raytheon had blown up pictures of American servicemen and women who were related to the workers on the floor of the factory, cousins and brothers and fathers and sons. And they had put these pictures in really prominent parts of the factory. So it wasn't just the American servicemen they were keeping safe, it was their family that they were keeping safe, their relatives that they were keeping safe. And so no one was asking the question, why are we creating these bombs in the first place? They're creating the bombs and they're keeping American servicemen safe. Now, I can't speak to what the discombobulation must have happened in their minds when they found out what was actually done with the bomb that they had created. But I can say that if we bothered to ask people, and I learned this from a professor and founder of Labor Against the Arms Trade, if we bothered to ask people who work in these factories, we would find that they would infinitely prefer to be working on life-affirming products rather than life-destroying products. And I do know that studies have shown that if we invest the same amount of money that we invest in war, if we invest the same amount of money in areas such as energy or infrastructure, healthcare or education, the return to the economy is significantly greater. So the military becomes literate in the stories of the people who bear the brunt of our wars, look at our own minds and what is going on in our own minds. And then as David Swanson said, get to the place where a just war, the idea of a just war, is just as offensive to us as the idea of charitable rape or humanitarian slavery or benevolent child abuse. And I've really been thinking about that. And I've been thinking that, in fact, our whole world presumes that there's such a thing as a just war. And remember, a just war, to be just, has to be a last resort. But our world presumes that there's such a thing. And we have international humanitarian laws, the Geneva Conventions, on what we should and shouldn't do in armed conflict. And in fact, at the end of the Second World War, members of the military from countries all around the world came together to create the Geneva Conventions, and they were ratified by 196 states, every country in the world. I mean, very, very few international treaties have this level of support. So think of how the world presumes that a just war can be legitimate. We don't have international humanitarian laws for charitable rape. We don't say, you know, slavery is bad, but as long as you give your slaves Sunday off and they only have to work a 12-hour day, we don't do that. No, we say rape is illegal, slavery is illegal, child abuse is illegal. And what we want to be saying is war is illegal, but we're not there yet. we also have to ask ourselves, do we believe there's such a thing as a just war? And I very much doubt that anyone in the audience tonight does. But when I first watched this debate between David Swanson and Lieutenant Pete Colonel, who's a professor of ethics at West Point, on whether there was such a thing as a just war, I went into the debate believing that there was, because I went immediately to the Second World War. I mean, yeah, we had to stand up to Hitler, right, in the Second World War. I forgot that that was 75 years ago, and we're in a completely different world today. And by the end of that debate, any ideas that I might have had about war being justified were evaporated. And again, I say, it is those of us who are outside the industrial, military, political complex. We are the ones with the clear perspective that as long as we think that there is such a thing as a just war, peace will not be possible. So I did this. I went to Wikipedia and I looked, I Googled all of the organizations in the world who are working for peace and justice. And there are thousands of them. I just reduced this. I know you can't read this. Let me just blow up. I will try and blow up the end of the eyes and you'll recognize some of these organizations. There are thousands. And I ask you, are we having the impact we want in terms of shifting our planet to peace consciousness? And recently I read the unpublished manuscript of Steve Leeper, past chairman of the Hiroshima Culture Foundation, professor at Nagasaki University, member of the Rotary International Group for World Peace. And he is so interested. He too feels that it's a question of consciousness. It's going to take a shift in consciousness. And he feels that the reason why we haven't had the impact we want is that we need to focus. He says that we peace activists tend to think that just doing something is enough, that the cumulative effect will change the world. And I thought about this for myself, and I definitely felt that just doing something would make a difference. My friends from Pivot to Peace will tell you that I go around saying all the time, we're building the 3.5%. We're building the 3.5%. We're planting seeds to grow the 3.5%. And I still believe that everything that we're doing in our own respective situations do make a difference. But I don't think any longer that it's enough. I think we do need to focus. And I look at all the things that we were interested in and doing in Canada, all the things that were on our list. And these are just slides I've taken from other presentations. We wanted to stop the arms trade with Saudi Arabia. We wanted to shut down CANSEC, which is North America's largest trade show for the military, happening in Canada in the national capital. And we wanted to educate people on the economy. And we wanted to cancel this ridiculous $19 billion that the Canadian government is planning to spend on fighter jets that will be obsolete by the time we get them. And we want to divest from war profiteers and educate people about war profiteering. And we want to create a Department of Peace in Canada. We're supposedly we are one of the 10 most peaceful countries in the world, yet we're only rated 77th by the United Nations for peacekeeping worldwide. And we want Canada to sign the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So when I look at all these lists of projects and I ask myself, which one of these projects stands out in terms of something that we could be focusing on worldwide? The one that leaps out at me is eliminating nuclear weapons from the planet, because that is something that everybody cares about all around the world. I know that you would support us in shutting down, in stopping the arms trade with Saudi Arabia, but I doubt that you would travel to Canada to participate in one of our actions with regard to that. But nuclear weapons matter to all of us. And Steve Leeper came to exactly the same conclusion in his manuscript. Let's focus on the elimination of nuclear weapons from the planet. And if we look at nuclear weapons and recognize that they affect every person on the planet, that they destroy our environment, and that they embody the very consciousness that is obstructing solutions to our problems. And they terrify our scientists. And I don't know whether you did, but I watched the unveiling of the doomsday clock this morning, today. And they've left it at 100 seconds to midnight. It's been there now for 3 years. And of course, the escalating nuclear arms race is a major reason for them doing that. So let's take a moment and just look at the consciousness that's behind the presence of nuclear weapons on our planet. And we can see that it's a belief that the threat of violence is moral if it prevents violence, and that this is the way to avoid war. And again, we know that's not true. And as since there's never enough, we have to modernize, we have to expand our arsenals. And a reactive mindset, even as we speak right now, there are military people training to be able to launch in minutes a bomb that will destroy our planet. Think of the sort of consciousness behind that. And the mistrust that we're creating with this first strike doctrine that the United States and NATO believe in. And the bullying, the US alone has threatened to use these nuclear weapons at least 30 times that we know of. And I say to you, this was new to me. If I take a gun and I hold you up, have I used the gun? Yes, I have, even though I didn't shoot it. So the very presence of this threat means that it is being used, doesn't it? And the potential for error with this many weapons and these many people handling them, fallible human beings, and this much technology behind them, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the fact that it's just inconceivably undemocratic, that just a few people in a few countries could have an impact like this on the rest of us. The staggering waste of taxpayer dollars. I ask you, what business do you know would be willing to invest billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in a product they could never use? What? And then the sheer denial of the humanitarian and environmental consequences. All of these weapons are trained on cities. They are trained to go to cities. And even if we value the Geneva Convention and the rules of war, civilian damage is to be avoided at all costs. And these weapons are directed at our cities. But disarmament is doable. It is doable. There's a straightforward solution. We built them. We can dismantle them. Nine countries could end the threat with controlled, verifiable disarmament. So let's recognize this nuclear consciousness is based on fear. It's based on fear. And our job is to shift that fear to hope. And there is reason for hope because, and we're celebrating that tonight, because we now have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which makes nuclear weapons illegal for the countries who have signed the treaty. And so it will stigmatize nuclear weapons in the same way that comprehensive treaties for biological weapons and chemical weapons stigmatize them. And we got to the point where even those countries who did not sign the international treaty for biological weapons, for example, does not use them any longer because of the stigma. And then this treaty also gives a voice to the 190 countries on our planet who do not want nuclear weapons there. It gives them a voice. And where we stand right now is 135 nations participated in negotiations, 89 states ratified, signed, and 59 states have ratified. 69 nations did not vote, including the nuclear weapon states and all the NATO countries. So that's where we stand right now. So ICANN, the organization behind the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, has created some strategies that we can use to work for worldwide endorsement of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And they've got two strategies. The I Can Save My City appeal, because these weapons are aimed at cities. And the global parliamentary appeal. Let's look at the I Can Save My City. And this is basically a request that cities around the world formally endorse the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we recognize that this is symbolic for a city to endorse the treaty. But when enough cities in a country do, that puts quite a lot of pressure at the federal government level. In Canada, all of our major cities now, from the East Coast to the West, Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Victoria, have all endorsed the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This really helps. And I know that some of you in this chapter are working on creating your city as a city of peace. And this is wonderful. And it's just one more step to ask your city to formally endorse the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this is what I'm saying. We can continue to do what we're doing locally, the good work that we're doing locally, and we can make it a priority to do everything in our power for worldwide endorsement of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Another organization working to create cities of peace is Mayors for Peace, and they, at the organizational level, have endorsed the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So that's one strategy that we can all be using. Another strategy is the parliamentary appeal, where we ask our legislatures and our parliamentarians to declare that they will work for the elimination of nuclear weapons from our planet. A great time to ask them to sign the appeal is during an election, but we can be asking them at every opportunity. We can ask them when we're hearing them speak, we can ask them as questions. In Canada, we have over 200 of our parliamentarians, from our senators to our federal government to our provincial governments, who have signed the parliamentary appeal. And again, the more people that we can get, there's thousands of them around the world, the more we can get, the more pressure we can bring for worldwide endorsement of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, you're Americans, and in the States, there's a special organization working for this called Back from the Brink. Many of you may already be aware of it. And it's an American-based organization for Americans, calling on the United States to lead a global effort to prevent nuclear war by actively pursuing a verifiable agreement for disarmament, by renouncing the option of first use, by ending the sole unchecked authority of the president, by taking US nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert, and by canceling the plans to replace the entire US nuclear arsenal with enhanced weapons that must never be used. And hundreds of billions of dollars are going into this. Imagine if those hundreds of billions of dollars were going into dealing with healthcare and the pandemic and issues that really speak to human security instead of into nuclear weapons. So I encourage you to please, if you haven't already, join Back from the Brink and support their efforts. So what am I saying? I am saying that it will take a shift in consciousness for us to achieve world peace. And that it will not be our current leaders, not most of them, who are going to make this happen. They have been swimming in the sea of the sort of industrial, military, political water all their lives. And it's those of us who are on shore. We are the ones with the perspective. We are the ones who know that as long as there are nuclear weapons, as long as we believe there's such a thing as a just war, as long as we think that we can resolve conflict with war, peace will not be possible. And we need to focus on a doable worldwide goal. All of the peace groups around the world to focus on a doable worldwide goal, the elimination of nuclear weapons from our planet. Imagine for a moment the shift in consciousness that would happen on our planet if we actually eliminated nuclear weapons. And there's overwhelming support for this from the general public. When the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came out, poll after poll after poll after poll after poll showed overwhelming support from the public for this. So I come back to my question that I asked you at the beginning. Why don't these fleas jump out of the jar? Now, when the fleas were put in the jar, a clear pane of glass was put on the top. And the fleas would jump up and hit the glass and fall back down again, and jump up and hit the glass and fall back down again, and jump up and hit the glass again, until they got to the point where they would jump up just below the level of the glass and fall back down again, just below the level of the glass and fall back down again. And once all of the fleas in the jar were jumping up just below the level of the glass and falling back down again, the glass was removed. And the fleas never jumped out of the jar. Fleas can jump 10 feet. This jar is less than 1 foot. They never jumped out of the jar. And not only that, baby fleas, fleas that were born in the jar, never jumped out of the jar. And so I say that our job as peace builders, as people building the 3.5%, as part of the 3.5%, is to show our leaders the way out. To show our leaders the way out. Our job, and I just love this picture of our planet, is to raise peace consciousness and to be the peace that we want to be in the world. And that's why I really love doing this work. It's a constant reminder to me to be the peace that we want to see in the world. Thank you very much.